It may be argued that there are no two things more central to modern French history than war and cinema. Cinema, which more or less began in France with the films of Georges Méliès and the Lumière brothers, has evolved closely alongside the nation in the 130 years since. War, an institution as old as humanity itself, has done just the same. The two are intimately intertwined in the French space. The history of cinema is the history of France, is the history of war. Here, 6 films by 5 different filmmakers will be examined, as we see how, through a select cross-section of 60 years of French film history, the nation has remembered itself in the war context. How is war, whether it be World War I, World War II, or the colonial wars of independence, portrayed on the French screen, and how do these portrayals reflect the thoughts and anxieties of the French people?
D'un côté des enfants qui jouent aux soldats, et de l'autre des soldats qui jouent comme des enfants.
Let us first look at The Grand Illusion, a 1937 film from legendary French director Jean Renoir. While the film is explicitly about the First World War, featuring a group of French POWs attempting to escape their German captors, there is no battlefield footage to be found. In fact, this classic French war film, regularly referenced as one of the most important in the canon, leaves the fighting entirely off-screen. The film claims that war itself is a grand illusion. War is about survival at any cost, and nothing is a guarantee. Class, nationality, religion, none of these dividing descriptors matter in war. The final scene of the film emphasizes this breaking down of boundaries, asking whether or not the men we followed throughout the entire film will ever really find peace. They land in the neutral territory of Switzerland, but perhaps Switzerland is just an illusion as well, a perceived place of safety and hope that is still ripe with flaws. With the film being released on the brink of another global conflict, World War II, the end of the film reminds the viewer that even though one can physically be safe from war, the story of human conflict is far from ever being over. Alain Resnais's landmark 1956 documentary Night and Fog takes this interaction with the audience to another level. About World War II and released in the midst of the wars of decolonization, this film, canonical both in French and global cinema, ends with the narrator addressing the viewer directly, causing one to question their own indirect complicity in the war, the Holocaust, and the broader oppression of minorities.
Qui de nous veille de cet étrange observatoire pour nous avertir de l'avenue des nouveaux bourreaux?
Post-war documentary cinema transformed voiceover narration, turning the didactic voice of the past into a reflective and poetic one. Again, the battlefield is nowhere to be found here. Instead, the film directly raises the question of whether history is truly doomed to repeat itself. Again, there is an ethical responsibility passed on to the viewer, a question that is both deeply personal and hugely universal. How should war and its horror be represented and remembered? In the 1962 film Cleo from 5 to 7, directed by Left Bank New Wave filmmaker Agnès Varda, we see a 2-hour time period in the life of Cleo, a French singer who is worrying about a cancer diagnosis. Throughout the film, we see her struggle to face her mortality and the frightening possibility of her death. Although set in Paris, Varda regularly uses subtle references to an off-screen war throughout the film. While walking in the park at the end of the film, Cleo meets Anton, a soldier in the Algerian war currently on leave. He is a man nervous to return to the danger of being a soldier, afraid of a pointless death. And Cleo, caught up in the nervous state of fatalism herself, is drawn to him. Memory and experience connect them. They are strangers, but they find comfort from their fear in each other's presence. Varda expertly uses the existentialism of the characters to reflect the concerns brought about by the Algerian War and France's decolonization. Cleo balks at the mere mention of the word cancer, mirroring France's own hesitation for confronting the cancer of war deep within its national psyche.
C'est un peu triste. J'aurais mieux aimé la donner à une femme, mourir d'amour.
Also taking place in France during the Algerian War, Jacques Demy's The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, released in 1964, is a musical contemplation of teenage romance. Geneviève and Guy, the two young, lower-class French lovers at the center of the film, are ultimately kept apart by one thing and one thing only: war. In the film's memorable final scene, Geneviève miraculously runs into Guy again after years apart, at the gas station now owned and operated by Guy and his new family.
Il est joli cet arbre, c'est toi qui l'as décoré.
Non, c'est ma femme, enfin, c'est surtout pour le gosse.
As the two former lovers catch up, they discover that war has driven them apart, creating an impenetrable barrier between them. Even though the war is entirely off-screen, even though we see not a single frame of it, the memory of the war is too much for the film's characters to overcome. This separation is highlighted visually as the couple talks to each other. Genevieve's car acts as a visual obstacle in the background where her child, a reminder of a life that ended with the war, remains and reminds. The use of shot-reverse shot further divides the couple, separating them in space and refusing to even let them inhabit the same cinematic frame. What subsists in between the shots, the images and memories hidden behind and within the cuts, keeps the couple away from one another. War changes Guy. Once he's seen what's off frame in Algeria, a life with Geneviève is untenable. Released in 1980, 2 decades after the Algerian War, Agnès Varda's Murmures is the only film of the 6 examined here that takes place outside of Europe. The film looks at the murals of 1980s Los Angeles, providing an identification to the often uncredited street art throughout the city. The film, like many of the murals themselves, acts as an archive of the forgotten people in the city's history, telling and preserving stories that were never told. In one scene near the middle of the film, Varda captures the Great Wall of Los Angeles, a massive mural that at one time was over 1,500 feet long. It tells the story of a number of oppressed social groups, and Varda, a filmmaker known for telling forgotten and unseen stories herself, focuses intently on the story of one group in particular, women.
Quant aux femmes, on nous les raconte, au commencement de la guerre.
As Varda frames it, the history of the American woman is separated by World War I. She, like the mural, notes the tremendous social upheavals that occurred in women's lives following the conflict. Varda draws attention to the fact that, for these groups, war has brought nothing but oppression. They fight for unfair wages, are beaten by the police, and are seen as nothing but cheap labor. Varda notes the mural has yet to be finished, suggesting that, like her films, it may be able to continue to capture memories and histories that have yet to be made. Finally, Claire Denis' 2000 film Beau Travail is, at its core, a film about lost and misplaced male identity. Galou, the narrator and self-proclaimed hero of the story, is a former member of the French Foreign Legion. He is dismissed from the Legion after being blamed for the death of another soldier of which he was jealous, and much of the film takes place as he writes his story from Paris. However, outside of a war context, he no longer has a purpose. Like many returning veterans, Galou's post-war experience is one without direction. His actions are removed from the appropriate context, just as his body is displaced from the appropriate setting. The metaphor to the larger French context is not particularly hard to see. Without the colonies, without a nation to exploit or a people to fight, what is France's new purpose? How does one render or construct a new identity after the context for which they have been trained disappears? We tell stories to survive. We tell them to ourselves and we tell them to whoever will listen. These filmmakers help shape, challenge, and change these stories. They dictate what should be remembered, and they remind us by excavating silent narratives and deploying the off-frame of what has been forgotten. To cast out the horror that has a name and a face, you must give it another name and another face. Chris Marker, a fellow New Wave filmmaker, would say this in his 1983 essay film Sans Soleil. Each of the films previously mentioned are intimately interested and invested in some French war, yet none of them tackle the issue head-on. Instead, these films reflect and mask their anxieties behind something, whether that be a musical number, a romance, or a mural. There is a named horror throughout French history, and that horror is war. It bears the face of colonizer and colonized, soldier and civilian, victim and murderer. These faces are at the center of the French memory, but through cinema, they are hidden. The horror then is cast out, given new names and new faces on film. War is the unnamed horror, and cinema becomes its mask.
Sous la pluie. Je me défile, je suis pas